Hello, this is Dimension, the first module from Ziqal, a new Eurorack builder based in Belgium. It's a super powerful 24 oscillator stereo polyphonic digital wavetable voice, all in just 10 HP. Now Dimension has actually been available for a year or so now. This is the Mark III version of the hardware, and Ziqal has been constantly tweaking the firmware since it was launched. The new version 4 firmware takes it to a whole new level by adding voltage controlled filters and amplifiers to the internal signal path. This means you can use it as a complete synth voice. It can be a monosynth with up to 24 oscillators detuned and spread across the stereo field, or it can be a full voice polysynth with up to 6 stacked oscillators per voice. And of course you could also use it as a straightforward wavetable VCO as part of a larger modular setup and run it through the filters and VCAs of your choice. Dimension is fully compatible with wavetables in the Serum and Vital formats, which you can load in via the SD card. There are gazillions of these available online, and you can make your own if you're that way inclined, so you're unlikely to ever run out of fresh raw material to use with it. And as well as letting you navigate through multiple wavetables in a single patch, there are a bunch of very cool morphing functions that let you mangle and reshape the waves even further in real time. Ziqal's distributor, Signal Sounds, very kindly sent over this unit for me to check out, and I've been playing around with it for a few weeks now. In this video I'm going to give you a tour of the key features, explain the user interface a bit, and I'll build up a few example patches along the way. In the meantime, here's a little taste of what it can do. So before I dive into Dimension, I just want to give a very quick overview of what wavetable synthesis is and how it differs from analog synthesis. Rather than generating traditional analog oscillator wave shapes like sine, square, saw and triangle, a wavetable oscillator plays back a single cycle digital waveform, essentially a very short looping sample. Several of these waves are grouped together in a table, hence the name, and there's normally a progressive variation from one wave to the next. To alter the sound, you can scan through these waves either manually or using a control voltage from something like an envelope or an LFO. And there will usually be some form of interpolation to morph between the shapes smoothly. This means you could simulate something like an analog filter sweeping a saw wave by having an appropriate selection of waveforms sitting side by side in the table and moving through them. But you could also have more extreme variations that don't have direct equivalents in any other synthesis method. And in that sense, wavetable synthesis is one of the most powerful and open-ended ways to create sound. The first commercially available wavetable synth was the PPG Wave in 1981, which went through a few iterations before PPG folded in 1987. Waldorf picked up the baton with the microwave in 1989 and went on to release several hardware synths featuring the technology from the epic Wave keyboard to the tiny Blofeld module. There have been plenty of wavetable-based VSTs over the years too, from emulations of the original PPG devices to completely new soft synths like Massive, Serum and Pigments. And there have been quite a few notable implementations of wavetable synthesis in Eurorack too. There's IntelliGel's Shapeshifter, IME's Piston Honda, Erica Synth's Black Wavetable VCO, Synthesis Technologies E-Series, 4MS's Spherical Wavetable Navigator, and Modbap's Osiris, to name just a few. Mutable Instruments' hugely popular Braids and Platts modules also included wavetable modes. Ziqal's Dimension is very much the new kid on the block here. So how does it measure up? Let's take a look. Now the first thing you'll probably notice about Dimension is this nice big colour display, which gives a graphic representation of the current wave along with the current note frequency in hertz, and 3 bars show you the current values of the A, B and nav macro controls, which I'll come to in a second. Next to it is this encoder, which lets you select patches and access the menu system, which is the beating heart of this module. Now there's no getting away from the fact that this is a menu-driven software-based module, but as you'll see it's a very quick and intuitive system to master, and it's certainly no more complicated than a module like Pamela's new workout. Below this we have the coarse and fine tuning controls and an SD card slot. Dimension ships with an SD card containing hundreds of wavetables to get you started. This is also a good point to mention that updating the firmware is super simple, just copy the firmware file to an SD card and boot up with the encoder held down. Next we have 3 macro control pots, A, B and nav, and by default nav will scan through the selected wavetable, while A and B are freely assignable to any other parameters. You can assign more than one parameter to each and set the range that they will adjust, so the system is really flexible. These 3 controls all have corresponding CV inputs with attenuators, and there's also an FM input with an attenuator. As of the version 4 firmware, this is through 0 FM, which I'll talk about a bit later. In the bottom row of jacks we have a standard volt per octave CV input to control the pitch, along with an input that will take either gates or MIDI depending on how you've got things set up. If you're using the internal VCA and envelope, you can use CV and gate signals here to play it as a monophonic voice, or you can play it via MIDI. There's an included 5-pin to TRS cable in the box, which is a nice touch, and this is also kind of essential if you want to use it in 4-voice poly mode. Having said that, there are also chord and scale voice modes which let you play up to 4-note chords via a single pitch input, so you have a few options here. I'll come on to those modes a bit later. Finally, there are 2 outputs which you can set up as a stereo pair or as a mono main output with a secondary aux output that can be a second wavetable or an LFO. You can even use this to output various kinds of converted MIDI data from that TRS input. Now let's take a look through the menus and start making some noises. Okay, so I popped a couple of other modules into this pod to help me build up some patches. I've got the Geranalog Contour 1, which I'm going to use for some envelopes. I've got the TACAB RLFO, which I'll use for some LFOs and sample and hold. And I'm running the output of Dimension through the Expert Sleepers disting, which I'll use later for some reverb and delay effects. At the moment it's completely dry though. I've also got the Arturia Keystep 37 set up here on the side, and I'm using the included 5-pin to TRS MIDI adapter cable to run the MIDI out into the MIDI input of Dimension, which means I can play it from the keyboard. Like so. Okay, so I'm going to build up a really simple patch using a really simple wavetable just to introduce some of the core concepts of the module, how the menu system works, how to assign the macro controls, that kind of thing. So if we hit the encoder, it brings up the available menus, and I'll just walk through what each of them involve. The nav menu is the first one. This is where you select how many wavetables are in use in the patch and what those wavetables are. There's an internal pool of 25 wavetables at any one time you can pick from, and you can load wavetables into that pool from the SD card. Obviously you can have a huge number on that SD card, but you only have 25 to pick from at any one time. So at the moment I've got this init wavetable selected, which is a very simple one with a few analog wave shapes on it. Next menu along is unison menu, or uni. This is where you select how many voices are available for each note. At the moment I've just kept it to 1, and I'll come back into this in a while when we get this patch built up. Filter menu is where you select the filter type. You've got low pass, high pass and band pass modes, all 24 BD per octave, 4-pole designs. Leave that off for the moment. VCA menu is where you set the envelope for the internal VCA. At the moment it's just set to this very short attack, full sustain, slight release. Dead simple. I'll come into that again in a moment as well. The warp menu I'm going to explore in one of the later patches. This is a way to kind of manipulate and mangle these waves in real time. The voices menu is where you set the mode, whether it's mono, poly, or the internal chord or scale modes. I'm going to keep it in 4-voice poly mode for this first patch, so we can have some overlapping notes. The SD card is where you can load wavetables from the SD card. This is the menu structure that's on the card. You can load those into the internal wavetable pool. And finally, the config menu is where you can configure various global options on the patch level. You can rename, initialize, set the navigation mode, whether it's interpolated or raw, that kind of thing. You can set what the aux output does. At the moment, I've kept that on stereo. You can sort of globally activate the VCA and envelope and the filter. You can set the receiving MIDI channel. You can view the wavetables that are in the internal wavetable pool of 25 that I just mentioned. And you can save and load the session. A session is basically the entire memory contents, all the patches, what wavetables are in the pool, all these settings. And there's a few customization options too. You can adjust the display brightness. You can choose whether the frequency displays or a note name displays on the home page, and you can adjust the range of the fine-tuning knob. So with all that in mind, let's start a little sequence, and then I'll start adjusting some of these parameters and making this a bit more complex. So here's a little sequence from the key step. And the nav control is by default set to scan through the waves in the table. So if I adjust this, we get to the square and through to the saw. Let's bring it back to the square for starters. And then let's go into the menu. Let's go to the unison menu and let's stack a few more voices to get this sounding a bit richer. Let's go for 4 voices, and you can adjust the detune. All the way to very extreme. mainstream settings, it sounds quite nice and chorusy around about the 20 to 30 range. Let's go for 33. The spread lets you change the stereo spread of them. At 100%, the even ones are on the left and the odd ones are on the right, I think, or vice versa. So let's keep the spread in the center. And the mix basically adjusts the relative levels of each of these in a way that I haven't quite figured out, to be honest, but let's leave that at 50% as well. And sync lets you choose whether, with every new note, the waves start together. Resets the sync of each wave of all these voices with each note. Or you can pick a random sync point. This is more noticeable, to be honest, on some of the more complex wave shapes. Let's just leave that off. And let's go back into, 4 voices. Now it's sounding quite bright. Let's activate the filter. Let's put that in low pass mode. And obviously the cutoff is down at 0. Let's bring that cutoff back up. Now if we wanted to assign this cutoff to one of these macro controls, we just press and hold the encoder on that, and we can set A, B or nav, one of the 3 knobs. Let's set it to knob A, and we can set the minimum and maximum range. By default it will just cover the full range. And when we close that, now this knob here is adjusting the filter cutoff. Likewise with the resonance. If we click and hold on the encoder there, let's set that to B. Again, let's just have the full range. And now we have resonance. Let's bring the sequence down a bit. So it's not the most incredible sounding filter ever made, but it's quite nice to have that option. Let's bring the cutoff down to about halfway, a little bit of resonance, and there's also an envelope built into the filter here as well. Let's add a little bit of, well, let's set the envelope up with, let's try a sort of decay envelope. Take that sustain down, and then let's add a bit of envelope depth. That'll give it a little. And let's patch in a little bit of LFO. I'm just going to take a triangle LFO from the TACAB next to it, and I'll go into the A and I'll bring up this attenuator. And what's nice is you can kind of see the effect of this modulation on the display. So I'm just going to slowly modulate that filter up and down very subtly, just a little smidgen of that, just to give it a bit of variation. And we'll come out of there. Now this VCA envelope, let's try softening the attack slightly. And let's try extending this release time. You can hear this 4-voice poly. We've got these notes overlapping now. So that's basically assigning macro controls. Again, I can bring the resonance up. Let's add a little bit of reverb. Already quite a nice sound. So next I want to look at a couple of ways to mangle the wave by modulating the scanning through the wavetable itself, and by using the built-in warp modes to kind of stretch and reshape those waves in real time. You can get some really interesting and unique textures this way. So the wavetable I've got selected at the moment is one called Mandatory 2. It's a nice complex one that starts from a sine wave, and as you scan through, kind of folds, get this kind of digital aliasing. There's here a really cool digital wavefolded kind of table. So if I play a little sequence in, I'm in just mono mode, just one voice, keeping it dead simple. I'm going to take a copy of the gate output from the key step 37 into the trigger in of contour 1 to generate a little decay envelope. And let's take the output of contour 1 here into the nav. Increase this attenuator here. So now we're kind of enveloping the wavetable position. And of course, by adjusting this, we can set the start point. And the amount of modulation will get to the further extremes of the table. I can play with the envelope shape in Contour 1 here, make it a bit more snappy. Get these really nice kind of percussive bass line effects. Add a little tiny splash of reverb to this. So that's pretty cool. But there's another way we can also mangle the sound using the built-in warp mode. So let's go back to take that modulation down. I've got it back to the kind of sine wave in the table. And let's flick along to the warp mode, and let's turn that on. And there's various types of warping you can do here. They're all listed in this little menu. You can bend, squeeze, stretch, rubber, mirror, PWM, folding, distort, sync, enveloped sync, and bit crushing. Let's start with bending, and let's set the parameter. Let's map that parameter to macro control A. So press and hold there, set A, minimum, maximum, done. A few clicks, and now basically this A macro control, you can see the effect it will have on the wave. Let's just get that sequence going again. So it's kind of squeezing that sine wave from one extreme to the other. Let's have a listen to one of the other modes. Let's try squeeze. It's like a high pass filter kind of effect there. And stretch, similarly, kind of pulls it in the other direction. Let's go back to bend, and let's take an LFO into parameter A and turn that up slightly. And now let's bring in the envelope on the wave shape as well. So now not only are we morphing through the table, but we're also bending those waves in real time. Get these incredibly complex. If you're into this kind of aggressive dubsteppy EDM kind of bass lines, you can get some incredible noises. Dimension's really good for these kind of warm 4-note pad chord kind of sounds. I've got this wavetable here with a bit of modulation to nav coming from a looping function on Contour 1. You can see it's kind of distorting the wave regularly like that. I've got another LFO coming to the filter cutoff, and I've got this nice kind of digital kind of pad sound. Okay, in this patch I'm going to use some sample and hold modulation from the TACAB RLFO to control the wavetable position, or the nav control, and also the wave folder in the warp settings. So let's just get a rhythmic sequence from the key step going, and then I've got a wavetable, again, single voice mode. This is a wavetable I've loaded in. It's actually taken from the Make Noise O Coast, I believe. Let's fire that on. And let's just take the gate output from the sequencer into the clock in on the sample and hold on the TACAB. And I'm going to take 2 copies of that, one into the into parameter A and one into the nav. So I'm going to manually scan through to about midway through this wavetable. And then if I increase the modulation amount, this is going to randomly pick away from the table on every note, basically. Every time this fires, it's going to sample a new random value and fire that into that CV input. If I just go to the warp menu, you can see I've got set up folding mode, and I've got the gain of that set to parameter A, so I can manually fold it like that. But again, if I take a copy of that CV from the sample and hold, every step's going to be a slightly different amount of folding and a different wave in the table, which means I get this completely randomly varying kind of tone. Add a bit of reverb. So one of the great things about Dimension, but which actually makes it quite hard to demo, is that you've got access to a nearly limitless palette of sounds. It's compatible with the Serum and Vital wavetable format, so you can download these online, stick them on the SD card and load them into the wavetable pool. It's really a pretty simple matter of loading in. You just go to the SD menu, browse the folder structure on your card. In this case, I've got a folder here of some wavetables I've downloaded online. You can let's grab one here, pick a slot within your pool, and just find an empty slot to overwrite, and it'll load in. It takes a little while to load in. It's not instantaneous, but once it's in there, then you can access it in any of the patches in memory. And yeah, the sonic palette is basically, as I say, unlimited, limited only by your imagination and the waves that you load into it. So to finish off, I've loaded in a table which I've downloaded online. It's one called 2 Tones. Not quite sure where I found it. It's quite a nice sounding one. I've got it in 4-voice poly mode. I'm just going to add a little bit of LFO to the wavetable position via nav. And I'm just going to meander away a little bit while I give you some final thoughts. So yeah, I'm very aware that I've only really scratched the surface in this video, and there's quite a bit of functionality I haven't touched on yet, but hopefully you get the general idea about what Dimension is capable of, and do check out the manual to learn a bit more about it. I think if you're looking for a compact, powerful digital voice that's compatible with a huge library of existing wavetables and you don't mind a bit of menu diving, then it really has to be one of the best options out there for the money. It's super competitively priced for what you get. To me, it strikes just about the right balance of power and simplicity. The interface is pretty intuitive, the menu system isn't too deep, and there's plenty of flexible modulation options. Some people might find it limiting to have just 3 macro controls for modulation, but I actually think it can help you to focus on what the really important elements of the patch are. Built-in filter and VCA are super useful if space is at premium and you really want to use it as a full self-contained voice. I would have to say it's not the most characterful filter in the world, and I do think the module benefits from having some analog modules in the signal path, but there's no denying you can get some pretty huge and lush evolving soundscapes out of this thing once you start stacking and detuning oscillators, and it's a really great counterpart to the more traditional analog voices that I've got here. For me, being able to use 4 voice digital chords within my Eurorack system opens up a whole new dimension, if you'll pardon the pun, so I'm looking forward to diving in a bit further. So anyway, that just about wraps things up. Hope you found the video useful, and please do like, subscribe, leave a comment, share the video if you've enjoyed it. I'll be back soon. Thanks for watching.